Hello, everyone. It's really wonderful to be gathering today. Thank you so much for coming. My name's Tom, if I haven't met you before. I am a second-year PhD student in the School of Psychology, normally based over at the Brain and Mind Centre. Welcome to several people who are also joining us online via the YouTube live stream. We can't see you, but it's great that you're here with us. And on behalf of the Sydney University Evangelical Union's postgraduate students and staff committee, I just want to extend a really warm welcome, especially if today is the first time that you're joining us, or if you've just decided to check out this session. We're really glad that you're here. The Evangelical Union's postgrads and staff group, we also call it EPS, is a community of Christian postgraduate students, professional and academic staff here on the University of Sydney campus. And yeah, one of the things that we do during the year is host a bunch of symposia, which are really an opportunity for us to gather together and have expert speakers and presenters come and help us to grapple with different ideas and challenges that we face in our work here at the university. And just as a piece of housekeeping before I introduce our speaker for today, for those joining us online via the YouTube live stream, there will be an opportunity to ask questions later on after the presentation. So feel free to pop any questions that you have in the chat on YouTube during the course of the presentation. We're monitoring that and we can ask them on your behalf at the end of the presentation. So today we have an excellent speaker lined up, and I'm really pleased to be able to welcome her. She's going to help us think through how to navigate difficult relationships in the academic world. And I'm sure this is a question that is relevant for all of us, no matter what stage of career we're at. Our co-workers are the people who we spend, we see and communicate with every day of the working week. So it's a real pleasure to introduce Lauren Errington, our presenter today. Lauren is a mental health social worker and clinical family therapist. She's worked with undergraduate and postgraduate students at the Australian National University in Canberra over the last few years. And she's currently on faculty with the Family Systems Institute and offers counselling with the Family Systems practice. So I'm really pleased to welcome Lauren, and I'll hand over to her now. Thanks, Lauren.
Thanks, Tom. Great. Hi, everyone online and in the room. It's nice to be here. I was thinking this week actually just about how much of my life has been wrapped up with universities. So I studied at a few different universities myself. My husband did a PhD at a university in Scotland, where we were very much a part of a PhD community over there. I teach at a university, and up until Easter this year, I was part of the counselling service at the ANU. So just have come at it from lots of different angles over many different years as well. But along the way, I was just thinking, I've heard many stories from people for whom the university experience was not what they'd expected. For so many people, I think at all different levels, what seems really straightforward on paper about studying a topic or a discipline, it's often confounded by the reality that engaging in the academic world also means some pretty intense interpersonal challenges along the way. And for many, these relational experiences can end up undermining their confidence, getting in the way of their work, and sometimes even hijacking their professional pathway. And so it's my hope today that I'm able to pull together some thinking about these relationship challenges that studying and working at university brings, and draw on some of my own observations as well about what this looks like. And I hope that in doing this, that it really starts a conversation going about what it means to be people who actually approach your studies with relational astuteness and emotional maturity, which I'll talk a fair bit about, which in turn I actually think can really enhance the university experience, but also your academic focus when it goes well. So to begin with, I just want to help adjust our thinking from thinking about ourselves in silos, which it can really feel like that sometimes, I think, in our studies and in our work, to thinking in systems. And so what do I mean by systems? No matter what sort of work you do or where you do it, it's a given that you're going to be bumping up against other people in the process. And where there are people, there are relationships, and some of these are more or less intense. And where there are relationships, there are systems of relationships. And so when I talk about systems, I'm thinking about the way in which we don't live or operate in a vacuum, but that we are relationally connected to the people around us in a way that kind of ebbs and flows in natural patterns of relating as social beings. This is part of what makes us living human beings, actually. And these relationship systems, when they go well, help us grow and develop and thrive. Another way to think about systems is thinking in terms of electrical circuits. So they are connected and they're dependent on the effective functioning of each wire to be able to operate together effectively and function as a whole system. Or a humanities description of the same thing, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Now, in a system, most of this happens at an automatic level where we act and react to each other in a way that if things are pretty calm, it goes relatively unnoticed and operate, let me just get that, operate pretty smoothly. If all the wires, for example, are operating well, then there's no problem with the machine. When relationship systems work well, they are flexible, they are incredibly creative and resourceful. Usually there is good communication, good contact between people, and the ability to problem solve when things get a little bit tense. But what happens is that when systems get a bit more stressed, they can become rigid, and patterns that are not working effectively are exposed. And in relationships, the relationships get tense, people get more sensitive, and there's a chain reaction of the stress kind of being passed around the system. And symptoms emerge that indicate the system is not working very well. There's complaining and blaming, avoiding and power imbalances. And it's a little bit like the electrical circuits are starting to overheat and they're at risk of burning out. And in that case, some parts of the system can end up overcompensating for other parts of the system. So you might be familiar with, in kind of classic anxiety language, we talk about the fight, flight and freeze response. And they're the responses that the body naturally has when it perceives a threat. And it's similar in relationships. What we know about relationships is that when there is a threat or there is tension in a relationship, there are some predictable responses about how we respond automatically. And they're these ones up here. So we conflict, that's the fight. We distance, that's the flight. We blame other people. We bring other people into our problems. Or we can go into overdrive and try and do everything ourselves, or kind of underdrive and expect other people to do things for ourselves that we could otherwise do. So these are all automatic responses. So when relationships get a bit too tense or a bit too uncomfortable, they're all ways that we kind of move ourselves to get into a more comfortable position in relationships. What that does is help us resolve the tension, at least for a little while, and makes us feel better about the situation. So take, for example, hypothetically, a tricky relationship you might have with your mum. There might be some tension there. For example, you might be told, or it's implied, that you're not calling enough, visiting enough, staying long enough, sending flowers for long enough, you know, whatever it is. And these messages from your mum make you feel a bit uncomfortable. They might make you feel a little bit guilty, a bit cross, or a bit sad. So some of us respond to this in the relationship by having an argument with her. She doesn't really understand what's going on for you and she really needs to know your side of what's going on. Some of us deal with this by creating a bit of distance in the relationship. So if I just ignore that for a little while, it won't get talked about again and it'll be fine the next time I see her. Some of us blame others. What about my brother? He never visits. You know, what about him? Or we might bring other people into our problem as a way of getting them to agree with us. So let me tell you about how unreasonable my mum is being to me, you know, side with me over this. Or we might overfunction. So we call every day, or we underfunction. We end up asking other people to do what we do ourselves. So substitute your mum in these examples for anyone else, and the same kinds of patterns can be replicated. So what do you do, for example, when things get tense with your friends or your partner? What about with your classmates or your colleagues? And what about with your supervisor? So emotional maturity is being able to observe what these relationship habits are when you get tense or when you get stressed, and to work on managing yourself differently in these relationships so that we don't always go for a quick fix just to make ourselves better, but we actually work hard to make sure the right people are talking to the right people about the right problem. So I just want to pause for a minute, because what stresses a system out or stretches a system's resources really can be something internal. So it can have to do with the people in the relationship, but it can also have to do with external stresses on the system. So if a system is exposed to continuous or significant external stresses over a long period of time, it's enough to exhaust even the most robust sort of system. So what this actually means in the university is that you're not studying in a vacuum either, and it's helpful to have some kind of idea about the organisational context that you're in. Which leads me to a key observation about universities, which is that they are anxious systems themselves as an organisation. And I would say that at the moment, they are extremely anxious systems. So think for a moment about the current state of our universities and the internal and external stresses that have occurred over the last 2 years. So while I was working at ANU, there was bushfire smoke, which forced the closure of the campus for a number of days, where we had the worst quality air in the world for those days, followed only a few weeks later by a hailstorm that absolutely ripped the campus to shreds. It was like an alien laser beam went through the campus. Now, these might be rare, but these environmental factors, they have a significant impact on how secure or fragile systems feel. When I was in Scotland, in Aberdeen, it was different. There was an oil crisis, and it was actually the oil crisis that really affected the funding on the university. So another environmental factor that really destabilised things. And then for all universities, of course, in 2020, there was, and there still is, the pandemic. And with it, the ensuing financial loss, the strain on international student relationships and business, the restricting of departments and employment redundancies, and that story is not over yet, and we know that's continuing to roll out. So these external stressors would strain any well-functioning system, and my observation is that the increase in stress for our universities, they become more rigid in response to that, and it leads to some of these predictable patterns in managing anxiety and responding to anxiety. In universities, I've noticed that the response to the kind of chronic anxiety, there's been persistent avoidance of some key issues or avoidance of key people was what I observed at ANU, or leaders coming over the top with a really authoritarian approach in an attempt to kind of garner some more control, and internal feuds within the university as well. Now, this anxiety in the system kind of circulates throughout the layers of relationships if it's not contained, and it can easily trickle down to the staff and student experience. And so I think it's just worth keeping that in mind as well. You've got your relationship systems, but you're also part of quite a complex and anxious organisational system as well. So one of the things that became clearest to me, I think, during my time as a counsellor at the ANU and kind of thinking about these relationships dynamics is that there's quite a big difference between what I would call emotional maturity and academic competence. On the one hand, emotional maturity is about someone's own self-awareness, about how they affect others and others affect them. They have the ability to experience emotions, but they can think for themselves and they stay connected in difficult relationships. Academic competency is about someone's intellect, their ability to engage and sustain engagement in increasingly demanding fields of study, and of course, perform well and achieve success in their related fields. Now, I think it's a really common feature for those who are academically competent to get through a whole lot of life without ever having to be confronted with having to work on their emotional maturity and how they actually operate in relationships. And in my experience, this is the case until they actually get to an impasse where their functioning is kind of interrupted by something like, for example, a difficult relationship, a failed experiment, and the overwhelming kind of worry about letting others down in that, or experiencing loneliness at uni for the first time, or having a disagreement with a colleague or supervisor. And I think it's really confronting for someone who's really successful in their work, and that's been their kind of mode of problem solving their whole lives, to be in many ways humbled by the thought that they actually have some work to be done on themselves. This work I used to talk to students about was about bringing the most mature version of themselves to their work, not the other way around, where they were dependent on their work to give them what ended up being a false sense of maturity along the way. And it's often hard work and uncomfortable work to be working on your own emotional maturity. So what does emotional maturity have to do with postgrad study? I think the nature of postgrad work is that it is, or will be at times, extremely stressful and probably exceed your normal coping mechanisms. And predictably, I think a lot of this will play out in the relationships that you're a part of. You will find that there are times that your emotional maturity is tested and these patterns of reactivity emerge. So for example, how do you cope with the stress of not being as far along in your project as you would like to be? How do you talk to your family about this or your friends? What do you move to do when things are not actually going well in your relationship with your supervisor? How do you react when people ask you how your PhD is going? I remember there was one girl that I met in Scotland actually who was so stressed out by her PhD and had been doing it for such a long time that she just actually couldn't really talk about it. And she actually became critical of people who even kind of stepped into that zone to ask her about her work and her PhD. Now, when you think about this, that kind of shifting blame to others is a predictable response to the stress, but so is distancing and arguing and complaining to others as well. And I think if you slow down to observe yourself, it will be worth noticing which of these can sometimes be characterized in your own responses as well. So one of the key relationships that is obviously crucial for postgrads is with their supervisor. And my experience is it can really make or break someone's experience of doing a PhD and being at the university. My observations from working at ANU is that this is an extremely sensitive relationship and can be quite difficult. And so it's worth actually thinking about what's going on in this relationship. I think the first thing to remember is that staff and students are operating, as we talked about, in this anxious system of the university, and that the pressure of these systems can filter down to affect even this relationship. I think it's also worth noticing that the students' project takes a significant portion of their life energy and their focus and their time. And this intense focus, I think, inevitably means that they're sensitive to feedback on it because of the amount of energy that's going in it. But that the project is one of many that the supervisor is engaging with and overseeing. And it's just a reality that they're often just not as invested in your project as you are. And I think this dynamic alone can be extremely frustrating, that mismatch. In addition, I think by virtue of their position, supervisors have a lot of power. So the dependence on supervisors for projects to progress and even succeed means that the power imbalance between supervisor and student is quite significant and can leave the student quite disempowered. Like any relationship system, I think when the supervision relationship is going well, it is open and calm, there is good communication and it's flexible, that helps the student flourish. But when it is stressed, there are predictable patterns of reactivity that emerge. And if they actually continue to happen over time, it can actually interrupt your functioning and your work. And so at ANU, these were some of the patterns that I observed, I guess mostly from the supervisee's angle about in these relationships. So one was there was avoiding contact with the supervisor. There was avoiding factual information and kind of getting stuck on emotions around the stuckness. Abandoning their own values and beliefs, and sometimes even abandoning their own academic ideas to just try and keep the peace and avoid conflict. Over focusing on the action or the inaction of the supervisor and blaming the supervisor, wanting to fix the problem as quickly as possible, and triangling in others by complaining about the supervisor as well. So I just want to say here, what I'm talking about is when there is tension in this relationship and observing your own reactions and responses in it. What I'm not talking about is when the power imbalance is tipped over and so far where the supervisor might be bullying or intimidating or undermining or sometimes even sabotaging a student's work. And unfortunately, this does happen. So while I think it is always worth observing your own response and worthwhile taking responsibility for your bit in a difficult dynamic, if you find yourself in a supervisory context that you think can be characterized by bullying, please talk to someone about it sooner rather than later. Even if you kind of think that might be happening, but it's hard to pinpoint what's actually going on, talk to someone. I don't know what the setup is at this university, but I know at ANU Counselling, our service offered support for students in that, and the academic dean would listen to these cases very confidentially and take those concerns really seriously. So don't just leave it and hope that it will get easier along the way. So sometimes that tension with the supervisor can be really overt and quite obvious, but also there are many times when these patterns of kind of emotional reactivity are much more subtle and they can slowly creep in a way that actually gets in the way of the work that needs to be done. So I'm going to share with you an example of a girl that I worked with who came to counselling for help with procrastination around her PhD work. So there's lots of ways you can tackle procrastination, and there's lots of kind of strategies and exercises that can kind of help mobilize yourself kind of out of some of that stuckness. With this particular girl, I tracked what was happening around her procrastination, and it was really interesting what came out. So she described that she would receive negative feedback from her supervisor, and sometimes that was quite minor, but it would become quite a big thing for her. She would become quite anxious and quite upset about this. She tells a friend because she's feeling anxious and upset. And, you know, she complains about kind of how badly done she's been by the supervisor. That makes her calmer, right? Because she's shared the anxiety, reduces her own anxiety and the tension, and she feels a bit calmer. She feels a little bit better. She re-engages with her work. But she starts to avoid going over the feedback that the supervisor has given. And she's conscious of this, and this starts to worry her. And so she actually starts to put off the work. She starts to procrastinate. This stresses her out even more. Friends become concerned about the student. They also blame the supervisor for what's going on. And the student feels bolstered by their support. You know, she's got people on her side who agree with her. And so she's able to re-engage with her work. That makes her feel calmer. You know, she's got people on her side agreeing with her. But she starts to avoid meeting with the supervisor as well. And this, of course, we're not moving very much, are we, with those lights going on? This, of course, starts to stress her out because the anticipation of meeting with the supervisor gets bigger and bigger. She starts to be late in submitting her work, which also escalates her stress and her low mood. And she starts to seek help for the study concerns. And that's the point at which I meet her. Now, I've tracked this as a cycle because the idea is that this is a pattern, right? And this can kind of just keep reoccurring over time. When I worked with this girl about this, we discovered that actually what was presenting as a study concern as procrastination was actually kind of shrouded in this anxious interaction and her own reactivity and sensitivity in the supervisory relationship. She observed that the only time she feels calmer in this process is when she has friends agreeing with her about the problem. But she also observes that her work is on a roller coaster that basically goes up and down with the relationships rather than her feeling in control of it. Now, there's a million ways a situation like this can play out. This is just one example. But what I find really interesting about this is that even an issue like procrastination or getting stuck on a topic or having writer's block can often be connected to our relationship sensitivities and these patterns of kind of reactivity. Now, I've borrowed this from a lady called Kathleen Smith, who's written an excellent book called Everything Isn't Terrible. And she has this chapter on your terrible boss. And it's a great book. But it introduces this idea that if emotional maturity is about raising your self-awareness about how you operate in relationships and observing when and how you are reacting to tension, then one of the goals is actually about taking action based on your best thinking and your personal goals, rather than keeping on reacting out of your emotions and your reactivity. So I think this is a great description. So she talks about the difference between a relationship with a manager that's based on emotions over here, and that's when it's really a roller coaster of highs and lows. That sort of dependence on the manager for positive feedback can keep you dependent on praise. It can prevent you from evaluating yourself, because the evaluation is always about what other people are saying or how they're reacting to you. That actually prevents you from being able to assess how well your work is going along the way. Makes disagreement unbearable, just very low tolerance for disagreeing with people. And it's likely to end in conflict or distance, is my experience too. But she compares this to a work relationship, and I would say a supervisory relationship can be subbed in here as well, based on thinking, which is low in anxiety, so it's much calmer, staying focused on goals, so personal goals and work goals. It isn't threatened by outsiders. So that's because the person is doing their own thinking and they kind of own their own goals along the way. That helps them to evaluate themselves and being less dependent on other people to tell them how they're going all the time. And it can survive disagreement. So because it's much clearer, it can actually bump up against other people and have disagreement without becoming a roller coaster of kind of highs and lows. So look, there's a lot to think about in terms of thinking about emotional maturity, but these are just some things that came to mind as I was thinking about this context. The first thing is observation of self in relationships. And I know I've said that again and again, but I can't really emphasize that enough, that a real starting point in thinking about this is really noticing what goes on for you in relationships. When do you feel uncomfortable? When do you notice tension? What do you do with that? You know, understanding your stress response, and I mean both physiologically and psychologically. So get to know what stress feels like in your body. Where do you feel it? How strong is it? What's low level stress? What's high level stress? What do you kind of move to do in that as well? And where does your thinking go? That's the kind of cognitive and psychological aspect of that. Where does your thinking go when you're stressed as well? Probably mostly connected to the first one, and that is noticing your anxious reactions in relationships. So when you're stressed and when you've observed kind of the tension, what do you actually do? Are there some of those relationship habits that you kind of fall into? Is there one that you do all the time, or maybe it's a mixture? Talk to someone sooner rather than later. This is often, it can be quite isolating, I think, the work in postgrad work, but a lot of people are probably having similar experiences. So make sure that you are talking to people out loud about the emotional process that's going on for you with it as well. I've said here, preserve your emotional energy, because you're going to need it at points in your studies. And by that, I mean, sometimes things like having a really clear routine, having a structure for your study, having some predictable things that go on during the week can actually help you not keep putting energy into making a million different decisions. So when you have a routine and when you kind of have a structure and you know what you need to do and when you need to do it, you can kind of free up that emotional energy for the work and to be able to focus on other things along the way. And take care of your mental health. I think, you know, 90% of the times that I was talking to people in counselling at ANU, I would be talking to them about getting outside. I'd be talking to them about making sure they're seeing people, you know, observing trees, exercising, all those really boring things that we know are good for our mental health. We're much better at observing ourselves and managing our emotional reactivity when our resources are higher. But if we're not sleeping, we're not eating, we're not seeing people, we're not exercising, your internal resources are lower, and it's just a lot harder to do it along the way. The last thing I just want to suggest, and this might sound like a bit of a funny one, but I actually think part of what can be really helpful in this mode of work is to write your own job description. So often you kind of fall into your study and your work, and there's like a million things to do, and it's very hard to kind of keep clear about what's going on and what your job is. And so my question is, if you had to write a position description for your role as a student doing the postgrad work that you're doing, what would it actually include? You know, get clear about what your actual job is and what it isn't. What do you need to do your job? What is in your control in this process, but what is out of your control as well? And how much energy do you put into the stuff that's out of your control? What questions do you need answered from your supervisor or from other people? What would KPIs look like in your job, you know, and how would you measure those? What sort of timeline do you need to get clear on for your job to be effective? And what personal qualities do you need to do your job? And what do you already have? What do you want to work on as well? These sorts of questions are really a step towards taking responsibility for yourself in the work that you're doing and bringing your best thinking to it. And it's better to do this when you're feeling calmer and you can think, which will then in turn help you when things get stressed or when you're kind of in those relationships that are a bit tense as well. Well, there's lots more to say, but I'm going to open it up for questions. So, and have Tom up.
Thanks so much, Lauren. That was, yeah, that was just really, really helpful and really useful and practical for many of us. I know in my own, as a PhD student myself, and yeah, having relationships with supervisors and colleagues, yeah, this has been really useful for me. We have some time for questions now. We have people on the YouTube live stream as well. So I just reiterate, if you joined a bit late, that you can ask a question by popping your question in the chat box on YouTube, and we're monitoring that here in the room. We can't hear you, but we can ask that question to Lauren on your behalf. So we would love to receive questions from those who are online if you have one. I might let people in the room have a moment to think of a question if they have one, but I definitely had a few. I think the first one on that last, or the second last slide, when you're talking about emotional maturity and talking to someone like sooner rather than later.
Mm-hmm.
What are your tips on how to identify who is a good person to talk to? You kind of also talked about how sometimes talking to a colleague can in the short term, that might feel like it's making it better, but in the long term, it's actually reinforcing a particular pattern that might make things more difficult in the long term. And at what point do we know, or at what point is it good to decide to seek out some professional help from perhaps a counsellor or someone like that? And is that something that's good to do proactively as well? Or what would you suggest? Yeah,
that's a great question. And it's a very helpful question, because it really does lead back to observing that emotional process in the relationships that you're in. So for example, I can give you an example. When I'm having a problem, I know what response I'm going to get from either of my sisters, and we'll call one of them if I really just want someone to empathize and join with me and ally with me and blame everyone else, you know. But I also know which other sister to call when I need someone just to kind of vent a bit and help me think, you know. And we all have people in our families and friendships and networks which will give different responses. And I think it's really it can make you feel better, you know, but I think what you want in that kind of talking to someone is someone who's going to help you think and raise your own thinking in that process. Not to solve the problem for you, not to take on the emotional load for you, but to kind of help you calm in a way that accesses your best thinking along the way. So sometimes that might be someone older and wiser and in a mentor sort of role. And there are certainly people like that in my own life that I've said, I want to stay in contact because this is important to me. And these are the sorts of questions that I need you to ask me, you know, along the way. Or you might just have some friends that kind of naturally do that as well. But so that's where that observation of self comes into that as well, about what are you attracted to? You know, we all have a pull to kind of be bolstered by someone's support, but really kind of thinking, because in the end, that's going to help build your own internal resources to manage that better in the future. And that's the goal of that. I think there's no harm in talking to a counsellor proactively and, actually what that means is that you're able to go to a counsellor and talk to them about and kind of share some of your best thinking with them, rather than kind of being in a crisis and expecting them to solve it. So if you find like, I think if you feel like or think you don't have those sorts of resources available to you otherwise, I think it's quite appropriate to go and talk to a counsellor or a third party about that. Does that kind of answer that? Yep. Question.
Yeah, that's
Thanks.
great. That's great. And I will also mention that, the University of Sydney does have does provide a counselling and psychological services, which is available to students and staff, free and confidentially, which is important to mention. Let me ask, does anyone here in the room or online have a question that they'd like to ask Lauren?
Thanks very much, Lauren. Terrific presentation. What you've told us about today are, I suppose, the universal truths that you've seen in your experience. But I wonder if you could dig down a little further in your experience from what you've seen and exposed to. What differences have you seen between individuals coming from the different sort of the demographics, more sciencey people, artsy people, male, female, young, old, and perhaps religious or non-religious? What kinds of, how do these points get nuanced in those different situations?
That is such an interesting question. And, it opens up all sorts of thinking for me. Like I worked with a lot of international students within the university context. And I don't think there's a simple answer to it. And partly I think because these are observations that we can make about human relationships across a whole lot of things. But the thing I would say is that what we get wired to in our relationship habits, if you like, are quite significantly shaped by the multi-generational experiences in our own family. Now that opens up a whole lot of thinking about family system stuff, but that might be tied to stuff like gender and socioeconomic demographic and cultural experiences and all of those sorts of things too. But I think my experience of working with people across cultures and religions and really kind of different demographics as well is that these are things that anyone can observe, and some people might be more relationally astute and be able to kind of dig deeper quickly, and take responsibility. But it's really about what people observe is working well for them and not, and it's only when people are a little bit uncomfortable about how things are going that they're actually motivated to make a change too. So that's not up to me to tell them to do that, So it's a really interesting question. I think particularly in systems thinking, there is a lot of work going on around how applicable are these ideas across different countries and different cultures and those sorts of things too. And I can definitely think of people I've worked with who have attributed some of the rigidity, for example, around expectations and guilt and performance and that sort of thing to their cultural background. But it's not to say it's only unique to them as well. So yeah, does that kind of answer that a little bit? Yeah, thanks. It's a great question. Yep.
I might ask another question.
Great.
If that's okay. Thanks, Lauren. I know, a lot of your more recent experience has been working with undergrad and postgraduate students when you're at ANU.
Yep.
Some of us here and online, there might be professional academic staff as well, professors or postdocs, teaching staff, university admin or operations staff. Do you have any words, I guess, just about dealing with difficult relationships or even bullying in those contexts and how that might differ from supervisory relationships between a student and an academic staff member? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, about bullying, did you say in particular? Sorry.
Just dealing with difficult relationships in those contexts in general, where there might, the power imbalance might be different, but
Look, I think the sorts of issues that come up with power relationships in work contexts, they are extremely sensitive and very difficult. And people get into positions where they just, they think that if they say anything at all, their job is on the line. And sometimes that, unfortunately, is the case, you know, because there are these alliances in the office and the office politics, you know, and all of those sorts of things going on. My first exposure actually to systems thinking was through a conference on triangles in relationships and triangles in the workplace, you know, and that was my first kind of foray into systems thinking. But I think these ideas can be applicable and challenging in whatever our work situation is. I do think, you know, whether it's a job description that you're writing or getting clear about what your own, what's okay for you in your work, you know, what I guess people talk about boundaries, and the way that I think about that is what will you put up with in your workplace, but what won't you put up with as well? You know, what is comfortable for you and what is uncomfortable for you? What's your responsibility in that? But what actually is out of your control in that, and that you actually think crosses a kind of inappropriate boundary. And then I think one of the most important things in that process is to keep those conversations based on observable facts and objective facts, because what can happen when it's so sensitive and we can be so emotionally reactive is that the subjectivity can just take over, and it's he said and she said, and, you know, and we're reacting to this, and, you know, 10 years ago they did this, you know, like, but actually working on objective facts and keeping a timeline of things that happened so that you can have informed conversations with the people that you need to about that helps it not be as kind of emotionally reactive or as biased in some ways. And I think that's a really important thing to do. If you find yourself in a situation where you think you are being bullied, it's important to be able to separate the facts from your emotional response to the thing. Because if you're going to talk to someone about it and someone is going to need to be held accountable, it absolutely has to be based on objective facts in the process. And so the clearer you can be about that, and you might need someone else to help you do that thinking, because it's hard to do that yourself. But I would say that's part of that process. Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Diana. That's
Cool.
Really practical. I see that we're coming up to the hour.
Yeah.
So let me just ask one more question.
Yep.
A lot of us here are Christians.
Yep.
How do you think our faith equips us and helps us in approaching our work, but I guess more specifically, difficult relationships at work?
Yeah. And I can speak to this from my own experiences as well. I think as Christians, we acknowledge and know that the world is broken and very messy. And part of living in a broken world is that relationships are very complicated and really messy. And as Christians, we believe that part of that is that sin creeps into those, and people are selfish, and we put our needs before other people, and we're proud, and, you know, like, there's all sorts of things that can get in the way of kind of having good and healthy relationships with the people around us. So I think that's the first thing I would say as a Christian. The reason I think systems thinking sits under scripture is because this, to me, makes sense of a broken world and broken relationships, and had some helpful descriptions about what that looks like, but also kind of what we can do in taking responsibility for our bit in that. And sometimes as Christians, I think that means being repentant, and, you know, and really working hard on being people who live for the glory of God. I also think there is a word of warning for us as Christians, where being people who are gracious and generous does not mean that you just let people walk all over you either. And I think I have seen that before, and I think that can be very difficult, because I don't think that's what we're called to, actually. And I think if that's you, if you're someone who goes into self-blame rather than blaming other people, and you kind of err on that end of the spectrum, then I think that's another thing to be observing. I think it's important as Christians that we are still clear in our relationships, in the knowledge that that actually helps other people in our relationships and can grow those whole relationships in maturity as well. So they're two things that kind of come to mind for me. Yeah. Yep.
Thanks so much.
Yep.
That was really excellent and yeah, really helpful. Thanks, Lauren.
Thanks.
Let me hand over to Ali, who's going to wrap up.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks everyone for coming, and thank you so much, Lauren, for sharing all of this wisdom with us. I can speak for myself, and I'm sure many people here have really valued to hear what you had to say. So we have a gift.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Enjoy. Thanks, people online too.
And just to wrap up for today, I thought I'd quickly reiterate that the University of Sydney does have these services available. So if you're a student, there's CAPS, and if you're a staff member, there's Semester, and it's a great thing to do to access that resource. And yeah, just in case you missed at the beginning, what we're all here about is to be people of God on campus. So we have Bible studies that run, we have symposia like this. This is the first one for 2021. And if you'd like to be involved in that kind of thing, if you'd like to be involved in a small group, please just let us know. We can figure out one that works for you. We'd also love to announce that ANU Day is coming up on the 4th of August, is when that is happening in Katoomba. That's a day where the postgraduates and staff community can come together to sit down and think about what it looks like to be a Christian at university and how we can do that and learn from some excellent guest speakers that we'll be announcing shortly. So if you'd like to put the date aside, that's the 4th of August. And one more announcement is that we're running COVID care packages. So this is for anyone who has been impacted by COVID and is unable to be with their family, that possibly their family overseas might be ill. We just want to care for those people in our community. So if that's you, or if you know of anyone that's in that situation, let us know. And if you're able to help out, we'd really love a donation to enable us to make those boxes. There's some information and a QR code on the stool over there, so you just grab a piece of paper on your way out to find out more. And I thought I'd just pray really quickly to finish up. And I've just noticed I'm not standing in the camera, so I'll move over here. Hello. Okay, let's pray together. Father, thank you that we can gather here today. Thank you for bringing us this opportunity to hear about how to handle difficult relationships and for the wisdom you have brought to us through Lauren. We praise you for the work you are already doing on campus in relationships already, and we pray that you would be using us to bless this campus. We ask for wisdom and patience to navigate these difficult conversations, and we ask that you would be with us in all we do so that we can be a breath of fresh air to those that we work with. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. So thanks everyone, and we'll see you at the next symposium if you'd like to come, which is going to be Chris Watkins talking about contributing to your field in light of the gospel, and at ANU Day if you can make it then. Thanks.
Thank
you.
I'll just shut this off.